July 12, 1943. The train screamed as its steel wheels scraped against the blistering rails, throwing sparks into the blazing midday sun. Dust rose from the Texas prairie and clung to the sweaty faces of soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder inside the boxcars. They had been warned to expect disgrace, retribution, maybe even slow starvation. Some murmured that America would treat them no better than livestock, creatures stripped of all human worth. But when the brakes sighed and the cars shuddered to a halt, what first met their eyes was not the harsh geometry of guard towers or the gray outline of concrete walls, but a man. He leaned against a fence post, one boot casually resting on the rail, a wide Stetson casting a shadow across his face, his metal spurs flashing beneath the pitiless sun. The German prisoners crowded to the barred windows, peering out through dust and disbelief. One of them whispered a word that trembled between awe and irony: cowboy. He had seen such men before, but only flickering across the screen in contraband American films back home. For most, Hollywood had been a fantasy world, as distant and unreal as any legend. Yet here stood the figure himself, flesh and dust beneath an endless sky that seemed to mock their confinement. When the doors slammed open, a heavy gust of air poured in, thick with the scent of sagebrush, cattle, and manure. It wasn't the reek of war, but the smell of life itself, raw and undaunted. The prisoners stumbled down, shielding their eyes from the sun, bound not by chains but by sheer exhaustion. Their boots sank into the soft dirt, so unlike the cobblestones of Bremen, Hamburg, or Berlin. They braced for mockery, rifle butts, and shouted commands. Instead, the guards, many of them farmers pulled into service, watched in silence, their patience almost disarming. Among them stood more men in wide-brimmed hats and worn leather boots, Americans who looked less like the soldiers of an industrial giant and more like characters drawn from pulp westerns. One German later wrote in his diary, "I thought we had wandered into a moving picture. Beyond the fence, horses grazed lazily, and those who guarded them moved with the calm assurance of ranchers watching over their herd. Only now, we were the herd." The irony cut deep. These were men who had fought beneath Rommel's command in North Africa, who had endured the heat of Tunisian sands, who had once believed in the superiority of the German will. Now, stripped of their weapons and pride, they faced Americans whose authority rested not on force, but on an ease of spirit, confident, unhurried, born from open horizons. To men shaped by strict discipline and shouted orders, the cowboys' relaxed posture carried a strange kind of dominance. A sergeant barked for ranks to form, and though they complied, many kept glancing toward the horizon. There were no towering walls, no endless coils of barbed wire stretching away, only the prairie rolling under the wind and the faint silhouettes of cattle in the distance. Unease crept in. It was captivity, yes, but a kind of freedom none of them understood, one that unsettled more deeply than fear. As they were led toward the camp, they finally saw the fence. Barbed wire, yes, but light and sparse, almost fragile. Wooden towers rose above it, yet stood empty, their ladders bare. The guards ambled rather than marched. Some even tipped their hats toward the locals who had gathered nearby. Children perched on the rails, watching the captured enemy with wide eyes. Women in sunbonnets fanned themselves against the heat, whispering about the young Germans who looked no older than their own sons fighting overseas. It was a picture of contradiction, enemies and neighbors observing one another across a summer haze. The conquerors had become curiosities. Inside, the camp unfolded more like a ranch than a prison. Long wooden barracks stood in tidy rows, with a mess hall at the center and wide fields beyond where the captives would soon labor. Their first shock came when the scent of food drifted toward them, beef stew simmering, the rich aroma of coffee rising into the air. For some, it felt like mockery. They had been told America would let them starve, yet the smell of plenty hung everywhere. One man muttered bitterly, "My mother hasn't seen beef in 3 years." The cowboy who had caught their eyes earlier still leaned by the fence, a blade of grass between his teeth. He spat into the dust and gave a small nod as they passed. The gesture struck harder than any insult could. It wasn't arrogance. It was calm indifference, the quiet confidence of someone utterly at home in his world. The Germans were herded into the barracks, but even inside, talk swirled around what they had witnessed. Some claimed it was deception, a trap meant to lull them before harsher treatment began. Others whispered of possibility, work, food, perhaps even respect. A young officer, barely 22, sat on his bunk and murmured, "If this is captivity, it's not what I imagined." Outside, the camp breathed with sounds of another life, a dog barking, a horse calling, and the low murmur of cattle drifting across the Texas wind. The prisoners lay on their bunks, listening in uneasy quiet, torn between a strange sense of relief and the sting of shame. They had once marched to war to expand a Reich, yet now they found themselves fed and guarded by men who seemed more legend than flesh. The cowboy was no myth. He was real, dust, sweat, and leather. And he lived with more freedom leaning against a fence post than they ever had while serving under Europe's banners. Night came swiftly, the desert swallowing the light. The horizon burned with the last threads of sunset as the prisoners peered through the cracks in their barracks' walls. That same cowboy stood again, now lit by a lantern whose glow traced the edge of his hat. From somewhere beyond, a harmonica sang a tune they didn't know but somehow felt deep within. For the first time since capture, the silence wasn't heavy with despair, but filled with quiet confusion. The morning had begun with certainty. Captivity meant humiliation. But by nightfall, that certainty was gone. Was this land of cowboys, cattle, and coffee truly their prison? Or was it, in some cruel twist, a glimpse of the freedom they had never tasted at home? That night, one man wrote by the dim flame of a forbidden candle, leaving behind words that would outlive the war. "I fear less the barbed wire than the horizon beyond it." For the first time, I wonder if we are the ones who have always been fenced in. The first morning began with a shrill whistle, cutting through the soft hum of the prairie and shaking the Germans from uneasy dreams. They rose stiffly, expecting the watery soup or hard crusts of bread they had been warned about during the voyage. But when they entered the mess hall, the sight stopped them. Long wooden tables were covered with steaming bowls of beef stew, tin trays stacked with cornbread, and pitchers of hot black coffee filling the air with its bitter scent. It wasn't luxury, not by American standards, but to men who had marched hungry through North Africa or eaten ersatz bread in Europe, it was abundance. Some hesitated, uncertain if it was a cruel trick. A guard, his hat pushed back on his head, waved them forward with an easy gesture. "Eat," he said, as if that was all that needed to be said. One prisoner lifted his spoon, tasted the broth, and shut his eyes. The beef melted on his tongue. Another bit into the cornbread and let out a quiet laugh. It was sweet, softer than any bread he remembered. Almost guiltily, he whispered, "My family hasn't seen white flour in years." Others nodded silently, each bite a reminder that their loved ones back in Germany were starving while they, the captives, dined like men on leave. Word spread fast. Letters home, carefully censored yet full of hints, described the unexpected plenty. A 1944 camp report preserved one such line, "Mother, do not worry for me. I eat more meat here than I did as a boy." Another noted the endless coffee, once a drink for Germany's wealthy, now poured freely into chipped tin mugs. Some guards laughed at the astonishment, remarking that the food wasn't even special. It was the same fare any farmhand might eat on an ordinary day. Outside, the barbed wire shimmered in the sun, but inside, the rhythm of ranch life began to seep through. After breakfast, the prisoners were led out, not for punishment drills, but to work details, mending fences, picking cotton, tending fields, or loading hay on nearby ranches. Under the Geneva Convention, they could be given non-military labor, and in these agricultural states, they were sorely needed. With so many Americans fighting abroad, the farms stood half empty. Now the former enemy hauled grain, carried water, and guided plows behind horses. At first, many complained. The POWs considered farm work beneath soldiers of the Reich. Some even tried to provoke confrontation, hoping to expose American cruelty. But the guards rarely shouted. They demonstrated, pointed, sometimes even lent a hand. One cowboy, sweat dripping from his brow, showed a young German how to lift a hay bale without hurting his back. The prisoner, flushed with embarrassment, copied his motion. Later that night, he confessed he had never seen an officer or superior help rather than command. Then came the next surprise: pay. Each man earned credits, about 80 cents a day, for his work. They could spend it in the camp canteen on toiletries, stationery, or even small treats like chocolate and cigarettes. For those who had been convinced they'd be starved, it all felt unreal. A corporal joked bitterly, "I fought for Hitler and gained nothing. I pick cotton for a cowboy and get paid." The exchange between captors and captives grew stranger by the week. On Sundays, local farmers who hired the Germans sometimes offered them lemonade, biscuits, or even a seat on the porch. One old Texan recalled years later that a young German had helped mend his fence, then sat quietly on the steps, gazing at the horizon. When asked what he was thinking, the prisoner said softly, "I've never seen a land so vast it doesn't end." His tone carried wonder, not anger. Yet such comfort stirred unease in the barracks. The abundance that once shocked them began to divide them from within. They worried they were becoming weak, lulled by kindness and good food, their loyalty to the Reich slowly slipping away. Others muttered that the Americans had no right to treat them so generously, that such fairness was its own form of humiliation. A few still clung fiercely to Nazi doctrine, scoffing at those who smiled during work or seemed to enjoy their American meals. Tension simmered quietly, splitting the men between those who guarded old pride and those who began to question what true strength really meant. American officers took note of these divisions in their reports, and in some camps, the most hardened believers were separated out for fear they might threaten the others. Yet in daily life, the boundaries blurred. A man could arrive full of arrogance and, within days, find himself humming cowboy tunes learned from guards, tapping his foot as he swallowed another mouthful of cornbread and coffee. The sensations etched themselves deep into memory. The creak of saddle leather as guards rode past the fences, the hiss of batter on a hot skillet, the sweet dry scent of cut hay drifting through the open windows of the barracks. These belonged to free men, not prisoners, and yet the Germans lived among them, experiencing America not as conquerors or visitors, but as unwilling guests who were, despite themselves, transformed. One prisoner later admitted in a memoir, "We feared the lash, but it never came. Instead, they gave us bread so white it humbled us. They poured us coffee until we could drink no more. They paid us to work their fields. In their generosity, I found not comfort, but confusion." His words caught the essence of their inner conflict. How could enemies show such humanity when their own leaders preached only cruelty? And still, amid this confusion, laughter crept in. A Texan guard once recalled teaching a German lieutenant to rope a calf during a break. The officer missed, tried again, and ended up tangled in his own lasso as the Americans roared with laughter. The guard later joked, "That was the only German officer I saw surrender twice in one day." For the prisoners, that laughter was both shameful and liberating. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the world they had been told to despise was not only stronger, but freer in spirit. By autumn, the camp's days had settled into a rhythm: work, meals, letters, the occasional baseball game glimpsed through the fence. Yet beneath that routine, the shock of abundance still stung. They feasted on beef while their families at home survived on potatoes. They drank endless coffee while their mothers queued for rationed scraps. Each bite became both a comfort and a reminder. One evening, after a long day hauling hay, a few Germans lingered near the fence, watching the sunset spill gold across the plains. Beyond the wire, a cowboy lit his lantern, its glow outlining his sun-worn face. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving behind only the hum of crickets and the distant call of cattle. One of the prisoners whispered, "He works harder than we do, yet he is free. Why do they treat us better than our own rulers? The question lingered in the warm stillness of night. They returned to their bunks, silent and uneasy. Their stomachs were full of bread and beef, yet their minds felt hollow. And as the lamps dimmed, more than one wondered if the real captivity lay not inside the fence, but within the chains of belief they had carried from home. The days stretched on, not with dull repetition, but with strange discoveries. Within the barbed wire, life began to resemble civilization, disturbingly so. The Germans had expected punishment and despair, but instead they found chances to grow in ways their homeland had never allowed. The barracks, once smelling of sweat and straw, soon echoed with the scratch of pencils, the rustle of papers, and the low murmur of lessons. To their surprise, America was willing to educate its captives. In the dusty halls of the camp, makeshift classrooms appeared. School teachers led English lessons. Farmers turned guards taught woodworking, and even prisoners gave talks on mathematics and history. Some bent over desks, sounding out clumsy English phrases. Others shaped rough furniture from pine, the scent of shavings clinging to their hands. At night, the barracks glimmered with lantern light as men copied new words into notebooks, whispering, "Hello, coffee, cowboy," testing each syllable with quiet fascination. It was a strange kind of liberty. Inside the fence, their world somehow grew wider. One prisoner would later write, "I learned more in 1 year of captivity than in all the years of Hitler's speeches." The irony was cutting. Behind the wire, under the gaze of supposed enemies, they had begun to think freely. Music, too, returned to them. Germans who had hidden harmonicas in their packs began to play again. At first, the mournful songs of home, and then, daringly, the American cowboy tunes they had heard from guards. Before long, small bands took shape. Violins, accordions, guitars, their melodies weaving together the rhythms of defeat and discovery. Guards often stopped to listen, tipping their hats in quiet respect before moving on. For the prisoners, it was unsettling how easily they could echo the music of a culture they had once been told to hate. With each passing week, the contradictions grew deeper, and the boundaries between enemy and host blurred just a little more. Newspapers soon appeared, printed on mimeograph machines, filled with essays, jokes, and even short editorials. Some editions featured debates about politics, while others shared poems scrawled in tight, slanted German handwriting. By 1945, over 400 camp newspapers circulated across the United States, each one a voice for men who, even in captivity, refused to be silent. In one camp, an editorial asked bluntly, "Why do we speak of superiority when the cowboy feeds us and we cannot feed ourselves?" Such words would have been treasonous in Germany, yet here they were written in ink and pinned to a board for all to see. Beyond the fences, work carried on. Prisoners harvested wheat under the open Nebraska sky, picked cotton beneath the Oklahoma sun, and branded cattle while ranchers offered them water when the heat grew merciless. The smell of burnt leather, the hiss of hot irons, and the dry dust in their throats became familiar parts of their days. Some began to take pride in their work, holding up their roughened hands as proof that they were still useful men, not just prisoners. One guard later remembered a moment that stayed with him for years. A young, thin German wiped the sweat from his face after stacking bales of hay. The rancher whose land he worked stepped forward, extended his hand, and said simply, "Good job." The prisoner froze, uncertain. In Germany, no farmer would ever thank a soldier. There, authority demanded obedience, not appreciation. Yet here was a cowboy, dusty and sunburned, treating him as an equal at work. The young German finally shook the hand, awkwardly at first, then firmly. Later that night, he told a bunkmate that the handshake had shaken him more deeply than any loss in battle. Still, not everyone adapted to this new rhythm. Some hardened their hearts, mocking comrades who smiled at guards or practiced English phrases. They called them weak, men seduced by the enemy's comfort. Friction grew. In several camps, loyal Nazis tried to dominate the barracks, bullying others into silence and reminding them of their oath to Hitler. American officials took notice. Reports described the effort to separate the fanatics from those who simply wanted to endure the war in peace. The barbed wire enclosed not only bodies, but their inner struggles, old loyalties clashing with new perceptions. And through it all, the figure of the cowboy lingered, a quiet symbol of another way of life. The prisoners watched as guards played cards beneath lanterns, laughed easily, spat tobacco into the dirt, and rode their horses with effortless control. Here, authority wasn't shouted or enforced. It lived in the tilt of a hat and the calm drawl of a word. For the Germans, raised under rigid order, it was bewildering. How could discipline exist without fear? How could command come without cruelty? One night, a prisoner wrote about what he saw. He had been walking near the fence, watching a cowboy lead his horse into the stable. The man hummed softly, pausing to pat the horse's neck, speaking to it as if to a friend. The German wrote, "I saw more kindness in his touch on that animal than in 1,000 salutes to my officers." It was revelation, authority not born of fear, but of care. Even humor bridged the divide. In one camp, prisoners played soccer inside the wire while guards cheered from the other side. When a ball flew too far, a cowboy kicked it back with easy precision. The Germans laughed, clapping and calling out mock cheers. The guard grinned and tipped his hat. It was absurd. Enemies sharing a game, separated only by wire. But within that absurdity lay a truth the prisoners couldn't dismiss. Humanity leaked through even the harshest fences, and with it came a troubling question. Was this kindness an illusion or something real? Could men trained to worship strength accept decency from those they called enemies? Each handshake, each meal, each melody pressed the question deeper. Some met it with defiance, clinging to the pride they had been taught. Others, quietly, began to doubt everything they'd believed. To outsiders, camp life looked ordinary. Work, meals, rest. Yet inside, each passing day wore down certainty. The fences held them in, but their thoughts began to roam free. They studied, debated, and played. And slowly, the idea of freedom crept beneath their skin. When winter came, the plains turned cold and silent. The prisoners huddled beneath blankets, their breath hanging in the frozen air. Outside, lanterns glowed as cowboys paced with slow, measured steps, their spurs clicking on the icy ground. Through the thin walls came the soft sound of a harmonica, its tune drifting through the darkness. Some prisoners closed their eyes and let it carry them away. Others lay awake, uneasy, realizing that captivity had given them something more dangerous than cruelty, the faint taste of freedom. And in the stillness before sleep, a question whispered from one bunk to another, a question none dared to answer aloud. If this is how America treats its prisoners, then how free must its people be? The war didn't end in the camps with cheers or defiance, but with a whisper. Rumors swept through the barracks in the spring of 1945. Germany had surrendered, the Reich was gone, and Hitler was dead. The men sat motionless on their bunks, staring at their boots, their hands, the rough planks beneath their feet. Some wept in silence. Others clenched their fists, unable to picture a world without the regime that had shaped their entire existence. Yet outside the fences, the cowboys went about life unchanged, feeding cattle, drinking their morning coffee, tightening saddles before dawn. For the prisoners, the fall of their homeland stood in painful contrast to the steady rhythm of ranch life that surrounded them. The Reich had promised eternity and left only ruin. The cowboy had promised nothing at all, yet he endured. Repatriation began at a slow pace. Trains once again lined the tracks, waiting to carry the defeated men back across the ocean. Many felt relief at the thought of returning home, but beneath it lingered an unease they couldn't quite name. They had arrived in America convinced it would be harsh, indulgent, and weak compared to the might of the Reich. They now departed burdened with contradictions, bellies full of cornbread, heads full of cowboy songs, and hearts carrying an unfamiliar sense of freedom. Letters from those final weeks captured the dissonance. One soldier wrote to his mother, "I return to you changed. The Americans did not beat me. They offered me their hand. They did not starve me. They gave me bread until I was ashamed to take more. They did not humiliate me. They allowed me to work. They paid me. They treated me as though I were still a man. Another described the Cowboys in particular. They live harder than we do, yet freer. Their discipline comes not from fear, but from respect. I think of them often. It was in those small moments, ones that seemed trivial at the time, that the change took root. A handshake after a long day of haying, a slice of watermelon shared beneath the blazing August sun, a harmonica tune drifting across the wire, carried on the prairie wind. For some, it was the sound of boots on a wooden porch, the faint chime of spurs like distant bells. For others, it was the image of a cowboy tipping his hat, not in arrogance, but in quiet courtesy. A gesture so simple it stayed with them like a sliver in the heart. The Americans had not set out to change them. The cowboy was no preacher, no propagandist. He simply existed. His calm, his steadiness, his self-assurance were enough. The prisoners began to weave stories about him, half in humor, half in admiration. They said he feared no officer because he bowed to none. They said his land stretched so far that he could never be trapped. They said his strength lay not in brute force, but in the way he faced the horizon, calm, unbroken, and free. These were not formal lessons, not found in the pages of any regulation. They were impressions, absorbed quietly and carried within, shaping how the Germans came to see both America and themselves. When they finally returned to Europe, many smuggled those memories home like forbidden treasures. Post-war Germany was a wasteland of ruins, ration books, and bitter winters. Yet in their minds lingered the image of wheat fields under the Nebraska sun, the sharp scent of endless coffee in dented tin mugs, and the vision of men who labored hard without cruelty. Some even tried to rebuild fragments of that life once they were free. Cowboy clubs began to appear in West Germany during the 1950s, where men wore wide-brimmed hats, strummed guitars, and dreamed of the open plains they had once glimpsed through barbed wire. Some even gave their farms English names, a quiet homage to the land that had once imprisoned them, yet granted them dignity. Historians who examined their letters and memoirs have long agreed on one thing. The meeting with the American cowboy left a deeper imprint than anyone realized at the time. It wasn't that every German renounced old beliefs or suddenly embraced democracy, but something had taken root. Small seeds of doubt about the myths they'd grown up with, and a reluctant admiration for a way of life both foreign and enviable. As one former POW admitted many years later, I went to America as an enemy. I did not return a friend, perhaps, but with respect. The cowboy taught me more about freedom than any general ever did. The Americans themselves rarely spoke of it. To them, it was simply the right course of action, to honor the Geneva Convention, to feed the men, to keep them working and out of trouble. Yet, perhaps unknowingly, they revealed something far greater. That power did not have to destroy, that strength could be calm, that freedom could live quietly in the life of a rancher who tipped his hat and carried his tools without arrogance. Still, for the prisoners, that kindness carried not only gratitude, but also guilt. They knew their families back home had endured bombings, hunger, and fear, while they had eaten beef stew and played soccer behind the fences. That guilt lingered, heavy on their hearts. Some even confessed to dreading the return home, ashamed to admit how well they had lived in enemy hands. One man said plainly, "We lived better in captivity than our people did in freedom. What does that say about us?" It was a question that offered no easy answer. It stayed with them as they boarded the trains again, as the wheels turned eastward, as the land of cowboys faded into distance. At the docks, many looked back toward the horizon where they had first arrived years before. Some carried books they had read in camp. Others held small wooden carvings of horses, handmade gifts, tokens of a strange peace. Most carried only their memories, but every one of them carried the same unspoken question. What did freedom truly mean, and why had they found it only in defeat? The trains rattled on. Through the windows, they watched America pass for the last time. Golden fields ready for harvest, cattle grazing in the sun, small towns crowned with white church steeples. A young boy stood by the tracks and waved, unaware that the men inside were once the enemies his father had fought. A lone cowboy rode briefly into view, his figure etched against the sky before fading into the dust. The prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, as if trying to hold that image forever.